Okay, in this session, we're going to be looking at topic 5B, which is energy transfer and nutrient cycles in the AQA A-level biology topic. So the first section we're going to look at is energy transfers in ecosystems. So we're just going to look at how some organisms get energy and then how that energy is transferred throughout the ecosystem. So some organisms, as you know, get their energy from the sun and others get it from other organisms. So it's all passed around and cycles around in different ways. That's what we're going to look at in a bit of detail now. So first we're going to look at is photosynthesis and biomass. So as you know, an ecosystem includes all living organisms that live in a particular area and all the non-living, so the abiotic conditions, so the biotic and abiotic conditions in a set area. In all ecosystems, there are producers, and these are those organisms that make their own food. So, for example, plants and algae, and they produce their own food through photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, what these plants and algae do is they use energy, which comes from the sunlight, and carbon dioxide, which they get from the atmosphere in land-based ecosystems, or they get it dissolved in water in aquatic ecosystems, and they use this energy and carbon dioxide to make glucose and other sugars. So they're going through photosynthesis here. So some of those sugars that are produced whilst the plant's going through photosynthesis, are used in respiration, and they use them in respiration as a release of energy for growth for the plants. The rest of that glucose, so we always say, oh, well, plants go through photosynthesis to make energy for respiration. And they do, but not all of that energy needs to be used for respiration straight away. So what they do with the rest of that glucose is they use it to make other biological molecules, because glucose isn't really a good way of chemically storing energy inside the plant's body. So instead, the glucose is used to make other biological molecules, such as cellulose, which is a really important component of plant cell walls. And these biological molecules make up the plant's biomass. And by biomass, we mean the mass of that living material. And these are really good chemical energy stores. So biomass can also be thought of as the chemical energy that's stored in the plant. So we can think of it in the two ways. We can think of biomass as the mass of the living material and as the chemical energy stored inside the plant. So energy is transferred through the living organisms of an ecosystem when organisms eat other organisms. So for example, producers, let's say grass, are eaten by organisms called primary consumers, such as maybe a rabbit. And then primary consumers are then eaten by secondary consumers, and then secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers. That gets us a food chain, which we will look at later. And that's the idea, basically. But photosynthesis is really, really important. So if we look in a bit more detail at biomass and how we can actually measure biomass. So biomass, can be measured as dry mass, or we can measure it using a calorimeter. So biomass can be measured in terms of the mass of the carbon that an organism contains, or the dry mass of its tissues per unit area. So the water content inside a living tissue really varies. So we use its dry mass as a measure of biomass rather than wet mass, because obviously the wet mass doesn't contribute to this chemical energy stored in the plant, so it doesn't make up part of the biomass of the plant. So if we're going to measure biomass by using dry mass, what we have to do is the dry mass is the mass of the organism with the water removed. So we have to remove the water first of all. So to measure the dry mass, a sample of the organism is dried. We often dry it in an oven that's set to a really low temperature, and the sample is then weighed at regular intervals, so often every day. Once the mass becomes reaches a constant level, you know that we've removed all the water. If needed, we can then scale up this result to give the dry mass, so the biomass of the total population of the area being investigated. Sorry, of the total population or for the whole area that's being investigated. A typical unit that we would use for dry mass might be kilograms per meter squared. The mass of carbon present is generally taken to be 50% of the dry mass. So whatever your dry mass is, 50% of that will be comprised of carbon. A different way we can measure biomass is using that calorimeter. So you can estimate the amount of chemical energy that we store in biomass by burning the biomass in the calorimeter. And the amount of heat that's given off lets us know how much energy is inside it. And as you know, energy is measured in joules or kilojoules. So all we do is we get a sample of biomass and we burn it, and the energy that's released is used to heat a known volume of water. The change in temperature of the water is then used to calculate the chemical energy of the dry biomass. And it's really that simple. So you can use one of the two ways for measuring the amount of biomass present, and it's up to you which one you choose to do. So what we're going to look at now is gross primary production and net primary production. And these are our chemical energy stores. It's really, really important at this point to remember plants convert light energy to chemical energy during photosynthesis. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So gross primary production, GPP, is our total amount of chemical energy that is converted from light energy by plants in a given area. So approximately 50% of the gross primary production is lost to the environment, and that's as heat when plants respire. And we call this respiratory loss, which will be symbolized with a capital R. So the remaining chemical energy is then called the net primary production, the NPP. So NPP equals GPP minus R, which makes sense. So your gross primary production is your total amount of chemical energy minus how much is lost due to respiration, and that would give us that NPP. So your net primary production is the energy that's actually available for the plant for growth and reproduction. The energy is stored in the plant's biomass, and it's also the energy that's available to organisms at the next stage in the food chain, so the next trophic level. So how much is actually available? Let's use a grass and rabbits example. How much is actually available in that grass for the rabbits to take? So these include herbivores, so the animals that eat plants, but also decomposers. So it's really important in these stages as well not to forget about decomposers. Often primary production is expressed as a rate. So rather than a set number, we use it as a rate. So for example, the total amount of chemical energy or biomass in a given area in a given time. So the typical units that we use for this would be kilojoules per hectare, HA is hectare, per year. So kilojoules per hectare per year. Sometimes it could be written as this instead. So you might see it as KJ. So that's kilojoules per meter per year. So whichever way, one of the two. When primary production is expressed as a rate, we call it primary productivity. So if we looked at an example, so we could have grass in an ecosystem and it has a gross primary productivity, the gross primary productivity of 20,000 kilojoules per meter per year, per meter squared per year. It loses 8,000 kilojoules per meter per year people meter squared per year as heat from respiration. So then you're asked to find the net primary production. So all you would do in this situation is 20,000 minus 8,000, which would give us 12,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, and that would be your net primary production, or your net primary productivity. Productivity because we're talking about this rate now, because it's a given amount of energy for a given amount of area for a given time scale. But also with net production, we can also calculate it for the consumers. So rather than just looking at the producers, we can also look at it for the consumers, because consumers also store chemical energy in their biomass. And consumers obviously get their energy by ingesting plant material or by ingesting animals that have eaten plant material. So not all that chemical energy that's stored in the consumer's food is transferred to the next trophic level. We roughly say that actually around 90% of the total available energy is lost in various ways. It could be because not all of it is eaten. So for example, herbivores might not eat plant roots. Secondary consumers might not be eating bones of other animals. So the energy that's in those parts of the biomass is not taken in. Then of the parts that are actually ingested, not all of the energy is taken there. And that's because some of the parts that we ingest are indigestible. So they are egested. I'm just going to add that word on. So they're lost as feces. So they're egested. That's when we remove them out of our system. So anything that's indigestible is egested as feces, and the chemical energy stored in these parts is therefore lost to the environment. Also, some energy is lost to the environment through respiration or excretion of urine. So we can ingest indigestible parts of biomass as feces, ingest them as feces, but also through excretion of urine as well, we lose some of that energy. So any energy now that's left after all this is stored in the consumer's biomass and is available to the next trophic level. And energy is the consumer's net production. And a quick reminder again, when production is expressed as a rate, we call it productivity rather than just production. So the net production of consumers can be calculated using this formula below. And this formula below, N in this situation stands for net production, like I just said, or our net productivity if we're talking about it as a rate. That's our net production, is N. I is our chemical energy ingested in food. So that's chemical energy that's been ingested. Oh, my E went right. There we go. Chemical energy that's been ingested by food. F is chemical energy lost in feces and urine. So that's what's chemical energy that's been lost in feces and urine. And then finally R, like we said before, it's same as before, all your energy that's lost through respiration. So when we're looking at those consumers, we've got a lot more loss of that chemical energy. So here's an example. So the rabbits in an ecosystem ingest 20,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy, but they lose 12,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of it in feces and in urine. We lose a further 6,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year using energy for respiration. And you can use this information to calculate the net productivity. Remember, because we're talking about it as a rate of a rabbit. So all you have to do here is 20,000 minus your 12,000 plus your 6,000. So your 12,000 plus your 6,000 give you 18,000. So you do 20,000 minus 18,000 to give you an answer of 2,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. So the rabbits receive 20,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, and their net productivity is only 2,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. So we can then work out the percentage of the efficiency of the energy transfer. So we do 2,000 divided by 20,000, multiply that by 10, and that would give us an efficiency of 10%. So that is how we calculate efficient energy transfer from one trophic level to another. And that's really important to know how to do that, because that can get asked as well. So that's just a basic percentage calculation there. So what we're going to have a quick look at now is some specific exam questions where they're looking at energy transfers in ecosystems. So here's our first example. In this first example, the diagram above shows the net productivity of different trophic levels in a food chain. And you're asked to explain why the net productivity of the Arctic hare is less than the net primary productivity of a grass, and that's worth 4 marks. So the first thing I'd say of these questions is just state the obvious. Not all the energy available from the grass is taken up by the Arctic hare. So that's the first thing, really just state the obvious for that first mark. So that would be not all of the energy available from the grass is taken up by the Arctic hare. So I'll get you your first mark. Why? Why is it not available? Well, because some of the parts of the grass aren't eaten, so that energy can't be taken in. As some parts of the grass are not eaten, as some parts of the grass you could put an example of part of the grass that might not be eaten, such as roots. That'll get you another mark. What else? Well, we also know that we've got some parts just aren't eaten, and then of the parts that are eaten, some of them are indigestible. So some of the grass will be indigestible. So will come out as waste. And then finally, how else could they lose some of this energy? Some energy is lost for respiration. You need to make sure you have that the Arctic hare here. Some of the energy is lost by the Arctic hare respiring. And that'll get you your final mark. So I'd say the main important bits here is we say not all the energy available from the grass is taken up by the Arctic hare, gets your first mark. Then tell us why. Some parts of grass are not eaten. Second mark. Some parts of grass will be indigestible. Third mark. Fourth mark, some of the energy is lost by the hare through respiring. Fourth mark, that gets you the 4 marks. The second part of this question then is the Arctic hare ingests 18,905 kilojoules per meter squared per year of food. Calculate the total energy lost of the Arctic hare. So I would always say is write the equation first, and the equation would be N equals I, so that's all your ingested food, minus what's lost through waste, feces and urine, and respiration. So we've got our MPP of our Arctic hare here, which is 2,345. The amount that was ingested is given here, which is 18,905. And that's going to be minus F plus R. So all we then need to do is rearrange this equation to work out what F plus R is. So F plus R is going to equal 18,905 minus 2,345, which gives us 16,560 kilojoules per meter squared per year. Another question that we could get asked on this is here. So for question 2, a farmer grows cabbages in one of his fields. Suggest how he could estimate the chemical energy stored in the dry mass of one of his cabbages. So we're going to use, for example, in this one, I'm going to use dry mass method. So he could dry out one cabbage, and you might want to say how. So for example, in an oven, I'll get you 1 mark. He could then burn the mass of the dry tissue in a calorimeter. Second mark, and then for your third mark, use a change in water temperature and room temperature of water to calculate the chemical energy stored. Stored in the dry biomass of the cabbage. That'll get you the 3 marks. It's actually quite a nice, easy question. People often miss points out because they get a bit complicated, but it's just wanting that process, that methods of how you do that. And then it's just another question following on from this. So using this estimate, the energy of the cabbage field was calculated as 156,000 kilojoules per meter squared. Does this represent the gross or net primary production, and give a reason for your answer? Well, this will not be the gross, it would be the net primary production. And that's because some of the chemical energy converted by the plant in photosynthesis is used instantly for respiration. I'll get you 1 mark. So to get your second mark, well, why does weighing it then not work? So therefore, it does not get stored, and this is the important part that most people miss, it does not get stored as the biomass of the cabbage. And so, like I said, it does not get stored as the biomass of the cabbage. And that's the part that most people miss, and then would lose that second mark because they just forget to say why that respiration part isn't there. So then moving on, we're going to now look at farming practices and production. So farmers know the theory behind energy transfers, and what they try to do is they try to use it to maximize production. So what you need to know really is how they increase the efficiency of energy transfer. So if you have a look at food webs to start off with, food webs you should be really familiar with, and they show us how energy is transferred between an organism. And we've actually got two on here. We've actually got a food chain that's also forming into a food web. So the first top line, the red box, is a food chain. We've got an oak tree, which is a producer. A caterpillar eats parts of the oak tree, which is a primary consumer. It's eaten by a starling, which is a secondary consumer, which is then eaten by Mr. Cuddles, which is a cat. It's our tertiary consumer. You can then make it more complicated and then add on a food web. But basically, food chains and food webs both show how energy is transferred through the ecosystem. Our food chains, like I just went through, show that really simple line of energy transfer. Each of the stages of the food chain is called a trophic level. So from going from the oak tree to caterpillar is going up a trophic level. Food webs basically just show lots of food chains in an ecosystem and how they overlap. So we add in the apple tree. Well, the caterpillar also consumes the apple tree. It's also consumed by the starling. It's also consumed by a mouse. The mouse is eaten by a hawk. Hawk also eats a starling. So you can see it starts to show that overlap in the ecosystem. Decomposers, so things like fungi, are also part of food webs. So that's important to remember, and they break down dead or undigested material, and they allow nutrients to be recycled. So they're really, really important. So farming practices can increase the efficiency of energy transfer. So most farming practices, all they do is they aim to increase the amount of energy that is available for human consumption. And there's two different ways that this can be done. Well, there's actually lots of different ways that it can be done, but you just need to know about two of them. The first one is this. This is simplifying food webs, and this reduces energy loss to other organisms. And so this is energy loss to other organisms. So pests, for example, can be reduced. So here's a simplified food web, and it involves a crop plant for human consumption. So we've got wheat. The wheat could be eaten by an aphid, a mouse, or a human. We want most of that wheat to go to a human. And you can see how it then could get lost, because that aphid could also be from a weed or the wheat, and the aphid's ate by a ladybird, and the hawk eats the mouse. So if we're going to simplify the food web to reduce energy loss to other organisms, the weed, the mouse, and the aphid in this situation are pests. And these are organisms that reduce the amount of energy available for crop growth. And therefore, they reduce the net primary production of the wheat. This ultimately basically just reduces the amount of energy that is available for humans. So if we can simplify the food web, get rid of food chains that don't involve humans, the energy loss is reduced and the net primary production of the crop will then increase. So if we simplify the food web, this basically means getting rid of pests. And to get rid of pests, farmers need pest control. So farmers can reduce pest numbers using chemical pesticides. So we'll go through a couple of examples of chemical pesticides. They could use insecticides. Insecticides kill insect pests that eat and damage the crops. So in this example, the aphid would be an insect that would be killed by an insecticide. Killing insect pests means less biomass is lost from the crops. So the crops are able to grow larger, which means your net primary production is a lot greater. Or you can use herbicides. Herbicides kill weeds, which are unwanted plant species. So killing weeds can remove direct competition with the crop for energy from the sun. So the wheat and the weeds, if they're grown in the same location, they can be competing for that energy that's coming from the sun. If we get rid of one of them, so the weeds, because we obviously want the wheat, we can then increase the amount of energy the wheat is getting from the sun. It can also remove the preferred habitat of a food source of the insect pests. So this can also help to further reduce their numbers and simplify the food web as well. So if the aphids, for example, their preferred habitat is living in those weeds, if we get rid of those weeds, we've removed their preferred habitat, which means it's less likely for them to be found there. Farmers could also use biological agents, and these biological agents reduce the number of pests, so crops lose less energy and biomass, and this increases the efficiency of energy transfer to humans. So they could use parasites, and parasites live in or lay their eggs on a pest insect. So again, the aphid in this example. And what the parasites would do is they would either kill the insect or they will reduce the insect's ability to function. So for example, some wasp species lay their eggs inside caterpillars. The eggs hatch and then this kills the caterpillars. We can also introduce natural predators into the ecosystem to eat the pest species. So for example, the ladybirds eat aphids. It's useful, but it doesn't really simplify the food web, so it can sometimes make it a bit more complicated, but it is useful. That's important to remember. But another biological agent we can use is pathogenic disease-causing bacteria or viruses, and these can be used to kill pests. So for example, the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis produces a toxin that kills a wide range of caterpillars. And actually what often happens is farmers can use an integrated system, and that combines both chemical and biological methods. And what this does is this combined effect of using both can reduce pest numbers even more than either method alone, meaning that that net primary production is increased even more. So the second thing that farmers can do to increase the efficiency of energy transfer is to reduce the energy lost through respiration. So if we reduce respiratory loss, it means that more energy is transferred more efficiently. So one way that farmers increase that net production of their livestock, and it's really important now at this point I'm talking about livestock rather than agricultural crops, and this is by controlling the conditions they live in, so that more of their energy is used for growth and less is lost through respiration and other activities that increase the rate of respiration. So for an example, movement increases the rate of respiration. So animals may be kept in pens where their movement is restricted. The pens are often indoors and they're kept warm, so less energy again is wasted by generating body heat. So this means that more biomass is produced and more chemical energy can be stored, and increases the net production and the efficiency of energy transfers to humans. So the benefits are that more food can be produced in a shorter space of time, often at a lower cost. However, this is the one that creates most controversy more than simplifying the food webs. Simplifying food webs is a lot more complicated than how we make it sound. Well, no, it's not more complicated. It is very simple how to simplify the food web. But the effect it can have on the whole biome and the ecosystem and environment around there is actually a lot more complicated. But this reducing respiratory loss is a very traditional way of farming, and it's now creates a lot of ethical concerns, because enhancing net production by keeping animals in pens raises a lot of ethical issues. So, for example, some people think that the conditions intensively reared animals are kept in cause the animals pain, distress. It restricts the natural behaviours, so it shouldn't be done. So it's why you see a lot more of organic farming or free range farming. So people get free range eggs from hens that aren't kept in coops. But you'll see there's a price difference because it costs more, because there's not going to be as much net primary productivity that's passed on. So there is a loss, and it will just cost farmers more to keep them in those conditions. So yeah, it's really important to remember. So what we're going to look at now is a couple of exam questions that are looking at these farming practices and production. So on the graph below, it shows the yearly percentage loss of a crop to 3 different insect pests, pests 1, 2, and 3. So after chemical pest, before and after chemical pesticide was used on the crop. First question is, for 1 mark, how do insect pests reduce the MPP of crops? So this first question, you don't actually really need the graph to help you answer it. So how do insect pests reduce the net primary production of crops? Well, they reduce it by eating the crop. So they eat the crop. So they eat the crop, reducing the amount of energy available for crop growth. Eat crop, which reduces energy for crop growth. Oh. That would get you that 1 mark. Oops. And then B, for 2 marks, you're asked what conclusions can be drawn about the effectiveness of the chemical pesticides from this graph. Well, straight away, we can see that it's not effective at all for pest 3. Has very little effect on pest 1, if not any at all. So again, this would be one of those points where I say in an exam, get out a ruler, measure them, check the sizes. From here, they do look roughly the same size, so it's pest 2 that's been changed. So from crop shown, so that's crop loss before and after insecticide use, and that's shown you by which pest it's reduced by. So, oops, sorry about that. So we could say, so the pesticide was most effective at reducing percentage crop loss to pest 2. 1 mark, and now you need to mention the other 2 pests. So it had no effect on percentage crop loss to pest 1. Oh, that's past pest 1 and 3. That gets you the 2nd mark. So suggest 2 ways in which a farmer growing this crop could further reduce the percentage crop loss to insect pests. Well, we've used an insecticide here, so how else could we do this? Well, it could be using a different insecticide, but also kills multiple pests. So we could say, an insecticide that kills multiple pests, because this one clearly only kills 1. Or use another, so you could say insecticide that kills multiple pests, or use another insecticide as well, as well as the original. Or, so that could get you 2 marks, or you could also say using biological controls as well. And that would get you 2 marks. And your final mark, explain 2 ways in which livestock farmers can increase the net production of their animals. Nothing to do with the graph, but it's that same topic. So keep them in pens, so respiratory loss through movement is reduced. So I'm going to answer this one here. So I'm going to say 1. And we're going to keep them in pens, which reduces respiratory loss through movement. That'll get you 1 mark, and then you need to suggest another way. So for 2, we could keep them warm, and this will reduce respiratory loss through maintaining body heat. maintaining and generating body heat. And that would get you that second mark to get them 2 marks. Now, the final section for this is nutrient cycles. So we're now just going to have a look over a couple of nutrient cycles that you need to know about. So organisms go through nutrient cycling, and fungi and bacteria, before we actually look at any nutrient cycles, we're just going to look at fungi and bacteria on their own in a bit of detail, because they've got a really, really important role when it comes to nutrient recycling. So when we talk about natural ecosystems, we're talking about ones that have not been changed by human activity. So in a natural ecosystems, nutrients are recycled through the food webs. But as we know, human activity often disrupts the cycling of nutrients. So microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi are a really important part of the food web. Many are saprobiomes, and this is a type of decomposer. And what they do is they feed on the remains of dead plants and dead animals and on their waste products, including feces and urine, and they break them down. And this allows important chemical elements in the remains to be actually recycled through the ecosystem. So these saprobiomes, when they secrete enzymes, and when they secrete these enzymes, they are able to digest their food externally, and they then absorb the nutrients that they need. And this is called extracellular digestion. And during this process, organic molecules are broken down into inorganic ions. And obtaining nutrients from dead organic matter using extracellular digestion is known as saprobiotic nutrition. So some fungi actually form something called a symbiotic relationship. And that's where it works together with another organism, and the presence of it benefits that other organism, and the other organism benefits fungi. And in this situation, it often happens with the roots of plants. And these relationships are known as mycorrhiza. So the fungi in this situation are made up of long, thin strands, and these long, thin strands are called hyphae. And these hyphae connect to the plant's roots. And when the fungi's hyphae connects to the plant's roots, it greatly increases the surface area of the plant's root system. This helps the plant to absorb ions from the soil that are usually scarce, so things like phosphorus. And then hyphae also increase the uptake of water by the plant. In turn, how does the fungi benefit from this? Well, the fungi obtains organic compounds such as glucose from the plant. So the first nutrient cycle that we're going to look in detail at is the nitrogen cycle. It will be one that you'll be quite familiar with. You'll have covered it at GCSE, but we're just going to have a look at it in a bit more detail now. So as you know, all plants and animals need nitrogen. They need nitrogen to make proteins and nucleic acids, so DNA and RNA. The atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen gas, but plants and animals can't use it in that form. We can't just get it straight from the nitrogen gas that's found in the atmosphere. So what's needed is bacteria has to actually convert the nitrogen gas into nitrogen containing compounds first. Then the nitrogen then is able to then enter those plants and animals. So the nitrogen cycle actually shows us how nitrogen is converted into a usable form and then passed on between different living organisms and the non-living environment. So the nitrogen cycle includes food chains. So nitrogen is passed on when organisms are eaten, and then 4 different processes that involve bacteria. So we're going to look at nitrogen fixation first. So we have this atmospheric nitrogen. And this atmospheric nitrogen that we've got here, we've just said animals and plants can't take it straight in. So we have to go through this stage of nitrogen fixation, which is happening here and here. We've got it twice on this image. So what is nitrogen fixation? Nitrogen fixation is when nitrogen gas, our atmospheric nitrogen, is turned into nitrogen containing compounds. And this happens, this biological nitrogen fixation is carried out by bacteria. An example of the bacteria is rhizobium, but there's other bacteria that does it as well. So you just need to know it's carried out by bacteria, and there's an example of one. And what rhizobium does is they turn the nitrogen, the atmospheric nitrogen, into ammonia. Okay, we turn it into ammonia. And this goes on to form ammonium ions in a solution that can then be used by plants. Rhizobium are found inside root nodules. So we find lots of rhizobioms inside root nodules, grows on the roots of leguminous plants. So leguminous plants are things like peas, beans, and clover. So when soil is very nitrogen poor, people are often encouraged, farmers are often encouraged to plant things like legumes, which are going to increase that nitrogen in the soil. And that's where that crop rotation of plants idea comes in, to make sure that soil isn't leached of all its nutrients, to always put some leguminous plants in. This is a mutualistic relationship, and that's because the rhizobium provide the plant with nitrogen compounds, and the plant provides the rhizobium with carbohydrates. So that's that sort of process here. So we've got a nitrogen fixing bacteria live in those legume root nodules, and the nitrogen fixing bacteria, we're at this ammonia stage. Nitrogen has become ammonia, and we've got this ammonium ions here. So what happens next? Well, what happens next is we have ammonification. So that's what's happening down here. So ammonification is when nitrogen compounds from dead organisms are turned into ammonia. So here's a plant. The plant has died. And the nitrogen compounds from these dead organisms are going to be turned into ammonia, and that's going to be turned into ammonia by them saprobionts that we spoke about before. And the saprobionts go on to form ammonium ions, which we have here. So we can get to ammonium ions by nitrogen fixation. We can also get there through ammonification. Animal waste, so urine and feces, also contains nitrogen compounds, and these are also turned into ammonia by saprobionts and go on to form ammonium ions. So again, the rabbit got waste, goes into this section, and it goes through this ammonification as well. So we've now got two sources of these ammonium ions from nitrogen fixation and ammonification. We then get nitrification. Nitrification is when ammonium ions in the soil are changed into nitrogen compounds. So here we go, got our ammonium ions here, and they're going to become our nitrogen compounds. And these nitrogen compounds can then get used by plants. And when they get used by plants, they are nitrates. So first, nitrifying bacteria. I'm going to give you the name of the nitrifying bacteria. You don't need to know it. This nitrifying bacteria called Nitrosomonas, which we've got there, Nitrosomonas, but you don't need to know it, changes the ammonium ions into nitrites. That's important that we've got that, it turns it into nitrites. Then other nitrifying bacteria, this one's called Nitrobacter, turns the nitrites into nitrates, and the nitrates can then get used inside the plants. So that assimilation is going to go into the plants and get used. And then the final process is denitrification. So denitrification is when nitrates in the soil are converted into nitrogen gas. And this is by denitrifying bacteria. They use nitrates in the soil to carry out respiration, and they produce nitrogen gas. This always happens under anaerobic conditions. So there is no oxygen present, and so in places like waterlogged soils. There is a few other ways nitrogen can get into the ecosystem. We can get nitrogen into the ecosystem by lightning, and this fixes atmospheric nitrogen, or by artificial fertilizers, and they're produced from atmospheric nitrogen or an industrial scale in the Haber process. You don't need to know anything else about the Haber process in biology. So the other cycle that we need to look at is the phosphorus cycle. So plants and animals need phosphorus to make biological molecules such as phospholipids, which make up cell membranes, DNA, and ATP. Phosphorus is found in rocks and dissolved in the oceans in the form of phosphate ions. Phosphate ions dissolved in water in the soil can then be assimilated, and assimilated means absorbed and then used to make more complex molecules by plants and other producers. The phosphorus cycle shows how phosphorus is passed through an ecosystem. So we're going to start off with phosphate ions in rocks here. So when your phosphate ions in rocks are released, they're released into the soil by weathering. So they can be released into the soil by weathering. And these phosphate ions are then taken into the plants through roots. So we're then leaving the soil and it's going into the plants through the roots. So that mycorrhiza, which we talked about in the nitrogen cycle, again increases the rate at which phosphorus can be assimilated. So that mycorrhiza is also important here. These phosphate ions that are found in the plants are then transferred through the food chain as animals eat the plants and are in turn eaten by other animals. So this whole section here could be quite a long food chain. Phosphate ions are lost from animals in waste production, so in the excretion. And when animals die, saprobionts are involved in breaking down the organic products. So that's including the decaying organisms and the feces and urine. This whole section here is going to be carried out by the saprobionts. And so they're involved in breaking down the organic compounds. And what they do is they release phosphate ions into the soil for assimilation by the plants to take it back up. These microorganisms also release those phosphate ions from the urine and feces. But we've also got this other part of the phosphorus cycle. So rocks can also release phosphate ions by weathering, but instead of into the soil, it can be into the seas, lakes, and rivers. When the phosphate ions are released into the seas, lakes, and rivers, these are then taken up by aquatic producers. So things such as algae and other primary producers found in water conditions. And these are then passed along the food chain through fish and then fish to birds. The waste produced by seabirds is known specifically as guano, and it contains a hugely high proportion of phosphate ions. And guano returns a significant amount of phosphate ions to soil, particularly in coastal areas, and it's often used as a natural fertilizer. So we're going to finish off this session by looking specifically at some exam questions on nutrient cycles, and then some more specifically about some other sections in a moment. So the diagram here shows the nitrogen cycle. All you're asked to do for 3 marks is name the processes labelled A, B, and C in the diagram. So if we look at this diagram here, we've got the nitrogen cycle. A, we've got nitrogen compounds in saprobionts, and the nitrogen is now going to nitrogen compounds in the soil. So that process is ammonification. So A is ammonification. And remember that's ammonification because in that situation, we've got the nitrogen compounds in the animals go into the soil, ammonification. B here is nitrogen compounds that are in the atmosphere are going into nitrogen compounds in the plant, and that's nitrogen fixation. And then finally C, our nitrogen compounds in the soil are going back into the atmosphere, and that was denitrification. You're then asked to describe the role of I've just spelled that wrong, that's all. Saprobionts in process A. Well, what do they do? They convert nitrogen compounds in dead animals feces and urine. So that gets you 1 mark, into ammonia. That's all you need to get those 2 marks. And then describe how saprobionts obtain their nutrients. Well, they get those nutrients, remember, because they secrete enzymes. And they secrete enzymes. And these enzymes allow them to digest their food externally. Then they are able to absorb the nutrients they need.